Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sky was ablaze, lit by streaks of fire that tore through the atmosphere like angry gods casting their wrath upon the earth. Dr. Alan Pierce stood, frozen in place, eyes wide with a mix of horror and awe. He had predicted this, studied the celestial patterns, and warned the world. But no matter how many equations he'd run, no matter how often he tried to convey the gravity of what was coming, nothing could prepare him for the sight of the city he'd called home being ripped apart from above. The first strike had hit near the outskirts, a towering explosion of dust and fire that obliterated everything within a mile radius. From his vantage point in the observatory, he had seen it all unfold, powerless to stop it. Another meteor crashed into the harbor, sending a tidal wave through the streets, drowning everything in its path. The buildings below shuddered and groaned, their steel frames crumbling like sandcastles under the relentless assault. He tore himself away from the telescope, heart pounding as the sound of distant screams reached his ear. There was no time. He had to move. The walls of the observatory trembled as another meteor strike landed closer, a deafening roar filling the air. Alan grabbed his bag, pre-packed with everything he thought he might need for such a moment, and sprinted for the door. He barely made it 10 feet outside when the building collapsed behind him, glass and stone raining down, but the blast threw him forward. His vision blurred as his body slammed into the ground. Dazed, he struggled to his feet, gasping for breath as the acrid scent of burning metal filled the air. Dr. Pierce, a voice called out through the smoke and debris. Alan blinked, trying to focus. The world felt unreal, like he was floating in some nightmarish version of reality. Then the figure emerged, a tall man in a tattered military uniform. His face was smeared with dirt and blood, but there was no mistaking the commanding presence of Captain Marcus Ford. Captain, Alan coughed, his voice hoarse. "Pardon me, Frank. We have to get out of here. More are coming." Ford nodded grimly, helping Alan to his feet. "Feet, too, we know we're gathering survivors. Come with me, we need your expertise." Alan barely had time to protest as Ford led him through the smoke-choked streets past crumbling buildings and burning wreckage. The world had gone mad in the space of a few hours. People were running in every direction, some dragging injured loved ones, others carrying whatever meager possessions they could salvage. They reached what remained of a park where a group of survivors had gathered. Some were huddled together, others tending to the wounded, and in the center barking orders while working on a damaged radio was a woman. Alan recognized instantly Samantha Turner, a former NASA engineer. She looked up as they approached, her eyes narrowing when they landed on Alan's fire. "You were the one who predicted this, right?" Alan nodded, still catching his breath. "I didn't think it would be this bad. The meteors, they were unpredictable. Every model I ran ... It didn't account for the sheer number." "Great," Sam muttered, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Well, we need you to figure it out fast. Our communication is shot, and we have no way of knowing when the next wave will hit." Aaron looked around at the makeshift camp. There were no more than 30 people, most of them dazed, some injured beyond hope. His mind raced. He had studied meteor showers for years, dedicated his life to understanding these cosmic phenomena. But this was something far beyond his research. "I need a telescope," he said, his voice barely audible above the din of the chaos around them. "Good luck with that," Ford said dryly. "Most of the city's in ruins, and the observatories are gone." Sam rubbed her temples in frustration, clearly running on fumes. "We don't have time to find a telescope, Alan. The city's falling apart. We need to move these people somewhere safe." Alan shook his head. "If I can get access to my research, I can predict where the next strikes will hit. We might be able to avoid them." Ford glanced at Sam, then back at Alan Ternell. "Where is it?" "North side," Alan replied. "But the roads? They'll be dangerous. The meteors are hitting randomly." A silence fell over the group as they weighed their option. Alan could see it in their eyes, the hopelessness, the fear, but he also saw something else. Desperation, and with desperation came a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, his predictions could give them a fighting chance. "We'll get there," Ford said finally. "We have no other choice." They gathered what little they could carry, preparing for the perilous journey through the wreckage of the city. As they set off, Alan found himself walking alongside Sam, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Do you really think you can predict where they'll hit next?" she asked quietly. "I have to," Alan said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "Dear, if I can't, More people are going to die. Sam glanced at him, her hardened exterior softening for just a moment. Do I then let so hope you're right? The journey through the city was worse than Alan had imagined. The streets were barely recognizable, buried under layers of debris. Cars were crushed, buildings reduced to smoldering rubble, and the constant threat of more meteors weighed heavily on their every step. At one point, they passed by a group of looters ransacking what remained of a grocery store. Captain Ford kept them moving, eyes hard, unwilling to risk a confrontation when their own supplies were so scarce. It was clear that the social order had already collapsed. People were desperate, clinging to survival by any means necessary. As night fell, the group took refuge in the remains of a parking garage. Alan stared up at the sky where the streaks of fire were still visible in the distance. Every time a meteor struck, the ground beneath them trembled, a stark reminder that their fragile sanctuary could be obliterated at any moment. We should rest, Sam said, sitting down beside him. Sari will need our strength for tomorrow. Alan nodded absently, his mind still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, some crucial detail in the data that might give them the edge they needed. But without his equipment, he was blind. Do you ever wish you hadn't studied this stuff? Sam asked suddenly, her voice quiet in the darkness. Hakuna, maybe you'd be better off not knowing what's coming. Alan smiled bitterly. Ignorance might be bliss, but it doesn't save lives. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that knowledge, no matter how terrifying, is our only weapon against the unknown. Sam was silent for a moment, then nodded. You're right, and we'll make it to that research of yours. We'll survive this. Alan hoped she was right, because if they didn't tell, the world they knew was about to vanish, one fiery streak at a time. Alan woke up to the sound of distant explosions, the telltale roar of meteors striking the ground. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the heaviness that clung to him after a restless night. Around him, the survivors stirred, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They had all heard it, the ever-present reminder that time was not on their side. Sam was already up, standing by the entrance of the parking garage, peering into the smoke-filled street. Captain Ford was nearby, speaking in low tones to a couple of his soldiers. Alan stood up and walked over, feeling the stiffness in his legs from the rough concrete they had slept on. Morning, Sam muttered without looking at him. Alan nodded. We should get moving. The strikes are getting closer. Sam turned to face him, her brow furrowed. How far are we from the lab? Not far, replied. Maybe a few miles, if we can avoid the main street. Ford approached, his expression grim. We're not going to avoid the main street. They're blocked off, or worse, we'll have to cut through downtown, but it's some mess out there. There's looting, rioting, people are desperate to... Alan sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Better than we go carefully. We have no choice if we don't make it to the lab. We're blind to run. Ford grunted in agreement. We'll stick close, keep the group tight. No one falls behind. The group gathered their sparse belongings, the air thick with tension as they prepared to leave the relative safety of the garage. Alan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The meteors were unpredictable, but human desperation was far worse. As they ventured into the streets, he kept his eyes trained on the sky, half expecting another fiery streak to tear through the atmosphere at any moment. They moved in silence, navigating through the rubble-strewn streets as quietly as they could. Alan's mind was focused on the calculations he'd already started running in his head. If he could just get to the lab, access his data, maybe he could figure out the next major meteor strike and give them some time to prepare, time to save lives. The further they ventured, the more evident the destruction became. Buildings were skeletal remains, their once towering forms reduced to twisted metal and smoldering concrete. Fires burned unchecked, casting an eerie orange glow across the shattered cityscape. Alan kept his head down, forcing himself to focus on the path ahead and not the carnage around him. Sam walked beside him, her eyes scanning their surroundings with military precision. She had been quiet since they left the garage, and Alan could tell something was weighing on her mind. You okay? He asked softly. She glanced at him, her expression hard, just thinking about the people we left behind. The ones who didn't make it. We can save everyone. Alan, I know, he said quietly, but we can save some. That's all we can do. Sam didn't respond, but the tension between them was palpable. Alan understood her frustration. He felt it too, the overwhelming sense of powerlessness in the face of such unimaginable destruction. But there was no room for doubt. Now they had to keep moving. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the street ahead of them, followed by shouts and the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Ford motioned for everyone to stop, his hand raised as he crouched low, peering around the corner of a collapsed building. "It sounds skirmish," he muttered. "Like a gang of looters." Alan's stomach tightened. The last thing they needed was to get caught up in a fight. They were unarmed, and the group was too vulnerable to risk a confrontation. "Can we go around?" Ford shook his head. "No way to tell how many there are. Could be more of them around the next block." Before they could decide on a course of action, a figure emerged from the shadows, darting towards them. Alan's heart raced, but Ford was faster. In one swift motion, he grabbed the person and slammed them to the ground, his knife at their throat. "Easy," the figure shouted, raising both hands in surrender. "You or I am not one of them." Ford hesitated, his knife still pressed against the man's neck. "Who are you?" "Name's Sil Lucas," the man panted. "We've been hiding out in the subway tunnels nearby, but the looters found us. I barely got away." Ford eased up slightly, but his eyes remained hard. "And why are you running toward us?" Lucas looked over his shoulder, his face pale. "Because they were coming. A whole gang of them, and they were taking everything, food, supplies, people." Ford glanced at Alan, then back at Lucas. "How many?" "Dozens," Lucas replied breathlessly. "I maybe more." Ford cursed under his breath. "We can't stay here. If they see us, we're done for." Alan felt a surge of panic rising in his chest. "How we need to get to the lab? It's not far now." Ford's eyes narrowed. "We won. Team make it if we try to run. Team." Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing off the buildings around them. The looters were close. "Into the alley," Ford ordered. The group moved quickly, ducking into the narrow space between two collapsed buildings. They pressed themselves against the walls, holding their breath as the looters passed by. On the street, their voices loud and brash as they raided what was left of a nearby store. Alan's heart pounded in his ears, his breath shallow. If they were found now, it was over. There was no way they could fend off a gang of armed looters, not with the state they were in. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. But finally, the looters moved on, their shouts fading into the distance. Ford exhaled slowly, his muscles relaxing. "Try, that was too close." Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow, his face still pale. "Spret, you have no idea how lucky you are. Those guys are ruthless." Alan's thoughts raced. Every delay, every obstacle put them further behind schedule. The Meteors didn't care about human conflict. The sky was still dangerous, and time was running out. "We need to keep moving," Alan said, his voice firmer. "Now, the lab is close. We have to make it." Ford gave a single nod. "Let's go." They emerged from the alley cautiously, checking for any signs of movement before continuing on. The tension in the group was palpable, but they pressed forward, their goal now within reach. Finally, after what felt like hours of navigating through the ruined city, they arrived at the lab, or what was left of it. The building had been partially collapsed by an earlier meteor strike, but the basement, where Alan's research was stored, remained intact. Sam looked at Alan, her eyes wide with hope. "Can you access the data?" "I think so," Alan replied, already moving toward the entrance. "If the servers are still operational, I can pull the meteor patterns. 1 TB easy, but it's our best shot." Inside the darkened building, the air was thick with dust. They navigated the debris, carefully stepping over fallen beams and broken equipment. Alan's mind was racing. Everything depended on this. He had to access the data. There was no other option. They reached the basement, and to Alan's relief, the servers were still intact, though they were powered down. Sam got to work immediately, using her technical expertise to restore power. After a few tense moments, the screens flickered to life. Alan's hands trembled slightly as he typed in his credentials, pulling up the meteor data. The patterns were complex, more unpredictable than he had ever seen before, but he could still make sense of them barely. His heart sank as the results appeared on the screen. "There's another major strike coming. Hey," he said, his voice hollow. "Bigger than any we've seen so far. If it hits, it could wipe out everything." Sam stared at him, her face pale. "How much time do we have?" Alan swallowed hard. Ford stepped forward, his voice low and tense. Is there anything we can do? Alan shook his head, his mind racing through the possibilities. There might be one option if we can reinforce the subway tunnels. They were deep enough, they could protect us. Sam's eyes widened. But we do need supplies, equipment there, so no way we can gather everything in time. Ford's jaw tightened. We ought to have a choice. Alan glanced at the group around him, their faces etched with fear. Terry, we have to try it. It's the only chance we've got. The group moved quickly, gathering what they could, racing against the clock. The looming sense of dread hung heavy in the air, but Alan knew there was no time for hesitation. The sky above had already begun to darken with the arrival of the next wave of meteors.